Hello, and welcome to Exploring Axon, a podcast where we discuss Axon Framework, Axon Server, and their ecosystem. I am your host and a software developer at Axonic, Sara. In this episode, I spoke with Francesco Strazzullo, a full-stack developer and consultant. Francesco started his software development journey writing Java applications. However, he has spent a better part of the past decade working with the front-end languages and libraries and researching on how to improve the design and functionality of JavaScript-based applications. We discussed the benefits and challenges of implementing domain-driven design, command query responsibility separation, and event-driven architecture when working on the front end. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Francesco, and let's have a listen. Hi, Francesco. How are you today? Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, Sarah. I'm nice, thank you, and I'm very happy to be here to talk with you about DDD.
Yeah, same. And I'm excited because we'll be talking about something that's a little bit different from my previous conversations with guests. So really excited to dive into some details with you. But before we do that, do you mind telling everybody a little bit about yourself, maybe where you are and what you do?
Yeah, I am Francesco Strazzullo, and I am a software engineer at Flowing, a remote first company in Italy. I'm living in Treviso. It's near Venice, in Italy, in the north of Italy, and I have a Java background as a developer. But in the last, I think, 9, 10 years, something like that, I work in the front-end ecosystem. So big JavaScript application, also manage also very, very complex JavaScript applications. And I'm also an author of 2 books uh, with 2 very different content, but it's strange, but they are related in a way.
Okay.
The first book that I wrote is Frameworkless Front-End Development. This was about working effectively without frameworks in JavaScript.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one is a new. It's out this year, 2 weeks ago, and it's about
Nice.
decision making for software developer teams. It's a book about a series of techniques that can help teams in choosing between patterns, frameworks, architectures, and so on.
Fantastic,
That's
and
it.
congratulations on the new book. That's really
Oh,
exciting. I know we
thank you.
talked about it at some point last year, but yeah, I didn't realize it was coming up. That's great.
Yeah,
Congratulations. Nice.
yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. So this is a really great way to actually introduce the topic that we're talking about today, which is front end and DDD applications and DDD within front end. So it's actually, as I mentioned, a topic that I haven't really delved much into in the past conversations. And you and I started talking about it last year as I joined one of the workshops that you were doing.
Yeah,
Probably was early last year, right? It was a while ago,
yeah.
and it was a very interesting topic to talk about and to see sort of firsthand being implemented. So let's talk about that a bit. So can you tell me first, how did you get interested in DDD? And being in the front end side of things, why is it important to actually talk about domain driven design in the front end sort of ecosystem?
Okay, I will start explaining to you how I thought about DD for front end because it's a strange thing because
Right.
it's because of my Java background. So I start learning JavaScript with a Java mindset. Okay, that was extremely painful
You
in a
kind of did
way.
it how I do it reverse. I did JavaScript
Yeah,
first, and then I went to Java, and I was like, "Oh, okay, this is nice." You
yeah.
actually confused yourself. Okay, great. Go ahead.
But I was I love JavaScript. Okay,
Mhm.
now I really love the way of thinking of a JavaScript developers. But at the beginning it was quite painful because
Right.
it's a completely different mindset. But
Yeah.
in the meantime, while I was learning JavaScript, I was continuing to writing Java code and learning about DDD. So
Mhm.
after sometimes I understood that a lot of the techniques that I learned in the books of DDD, I could also use them in JavaScript application that I helped me in these years in I think we're creating top-notch quality code bases for front end.
Right.
This is my story with DDD and front end. On the second topic, on why it's important, I think it's important because front end or client applications are becoming more and more complex, and front end developer has a lot of power now. If you think about GraphQL, they can just manipulate data on the front end in the way that they want. So they have also a lot of responsibility.
Right.
And so I think that it's time to start thinking about also how to move some of the techniques of DDD. I don't think that everything is comparable to the also to the front end or JavaScript application.
Mhm. Yeah, that actually is interesting. You mentioned that because we had a very similar conversation between two of the developers within my team, which is Axonic Cloud team, about the responsibilities between the backend and the front end. So, as you mentioned in the past, there was this overall understanding that the backend takes care of a lot of the functionality and the front end is more or less more static, and that's changing quite a bit now with, as you mentioned, GraphQL and some of the other libraries that are out there, for instance, Svelte. And so it's interesting to see that shift, which I'm sure if I talk to front end developers, they're gonna disagree with me and say, yes, a lot of the functionality actually has always been on the front end, which is a lot of times the case. But it's interesting to see that's changing and developing. So that's really interesting. You mentioned that, and we had this conversation literally yesterday, so that's really cool.
Oh,
Now,
cool.
yeah, exactly.
So it's an hot topic. So okay,
Yeah, it's a hot topic, definitely. At least in my team,
perfect.
we're constantly discussing it, especially when it comes to deployment. When we're talking about if we want to separate the applications, the front end and the back end, for instance, and how we want to handle the deployment of the front end versus back end. Do they need to be coupled? Do they need to be coupled? Things like that. So, yeah, there's a lot of conversation around that topic as well in within the team. So we did mention you actually just talked about your experience and how you got to learn a bit more about DDD, which was through your work within the Java um, applications and systems. And then you basically put in your knowledge of what you learned about DDD and sort of started thinking about it in terms of the front end implementation. So when we do talk about DDD, a lot of times we're talking mostly about maybe backend or operations and things like that. There are not a lot of resources about domain driven design and front end applications. And do you have any idea why?
Uh, okay. I think that one of the reasons could be an historic one because when people start talking about DDD, the front end has a complex ecosystem of tools, languages, frameworks didn't even exist at the time. So while you're going to talk about domain, you were talking about a backend or perhaps also desktop applications. Okay, we were in that age of software. So I think that the first thing is historical. For historical reason, people talked about other languages than JavaScript. Just like, for example, the famous book of Martin Fowler, Refactoring, the first edition was in Java, the second one is in JavaScript, because 20 years pass between the two editions. Um, and I think there is also a community problem. The community problem is on both sides. It's on the DDD community there is a problem, and also in the front-end community. Let's analyze before the front-end community because it's easier. The problem with the front-end community is that at the beginning, when I don't know how to explain, when people start working actively only with JavaScript, because before 10 years ago, it was not thinkable that somebody could actually work 8 hours a day on a JavaScript application. Okay, the front-end engineers, they even have like 6 at the time. But when I start creating the community, they arrived from different worlds. There was some designer that was started to coding, some webmaster that was started to coding, or other like me that was already developers that started coding in a language that was ugly at the time, because at the time it was ugly, and it was strange. So it was a mess. So we weren't ready as a community to work on that kind of high level reasoning. But there is also a problem with the DDD community because they don't think that JavaScript is a solution when talking about DDD. And I think this is because um, in JavaScript you don't have types. So people don't think that you can actually create an aggregate without a class. But I think that object-oriented programming is about objects, not about classes. So it's actually doable, but you need to deeply understand JavaScript. I think that today we are ready to match the two things because on one part, the JavaScript community became more mature about some of these themes. And on the other part, we have TypeScript. TypeScript is very similar to C# or Java. So it could be a lingua franca for both the words. But in my experience, it's actually everything is actually doable with plain JavaScript. So uh, it should not be a barrier language,
Right.
but actually it is when you need to talk between two different group of people.
So, if the JavaScript, in your opinion, do you think that was the main reason that people really tend to stay away from DDD when it came to front end applications? And do you think that the libraries that have developed within the front end, for instance, React, um, I don't know, Vue.js, and so forth, do you think those have helped the front end community kind of think a little bit differently about the domain and implementing that into their thinking?
Um, yeah, I think JavaScript is a problem because for a lot of years, as it was treated as a toy. If you talk, that's the main problem. Okay, so nobody actually thought that you can build a top-notch code base in JavaScript.
Mhm.
And so this is part of the problem. The other part that you mentioned about libraries and frameworks is another part of the problem because frameworks um, tried to, I'm starting with jQuery, okay? From
Yeah.
jQuery onward, they try to create a structure in a very, very messy world of front-end development.
Hmm.
And with messy, I mean by design. Okay, it's a bit chaotic to work on the front end because you have to work with the user. So
Right.
you need to think that the user can actually click in a place that they shouldn't be. Okay, so it's by design chaotic sometimes
Mhm.
working in the front end.
Yeah.
And the frameworks tried to frame giving a structure, but nobody was thinking about defend the domain from the frameworks. Okay, because everybody was talking just about framework because they were the hot topic.
That's a really interesting thing you mentioned, which is defend the domain against the framework. That's really interesting. So tell me a little bit about that.
I can give you an example. If you work, for example, in React,
Hmm.
they um, they suggest you for performances reasons, and then I can understand it why. To, for example, if you have an object, if the state of your page is are three variables, I don't know, free form input, they suggest you to put them in three different variables because it's more efficient to check for the change of a primitive type in JavaScript than a complex object. But doing that, you are binding the values in the UI component.
Right.
What you can do is to remove the object from the UI, and all the modification do that in a domain object, like DDD, or if you want, also hexagonal architecture or solid principle. It's not just related to DDD, will suggest. But the pain point is that you need to be very, very skilled JavaScript developer to do that. Because in order to keep the domain free from the framework and be effective performant, you need to do some tricks. You need to freeze some objects. You need to, for example, copy objects and not modify them by reference. So there is a bit of problem in applying DDD from the front end because of the chaos that I was talking to. You need to always be performant because you are the front line,
Right.
okay, on the user. So if something is wrong, the user actually get them immediately.
Right.
So it's not so easy to apply that, but it's actually doable. You just need a little of training, okay, mental training, and also sometimes also understand that you can lose a bit of performances, for example, in order to keep the domain as clean as possible from the framework.
Makes sense. Now, so we did talk about some difficulties and obstacles in terms of implementing DDD within front-end frameworks, for instance. But what do you think is the most challenging obstacle when it comes to applying DDD to the front end that developers would have to overcome?
Uh, is to think outside the box.
It's that
It's
different
the
mindset, isn't it? We
Yeah,
constantly
yeah,
talk about that.
exactly. Because I think that backend developers, also if they are not into DDD, but they grasp during these years most of the concept also by osmosis. Okay,
Hmm.
for front end, sometimes you really need to change your mindset.
Yeah, I gotta say though, for
Uh,
the back end, there's a lot of change of mindset and thinking outside of the box also that needs to happen, especially with some of the more experienced developers because they've been so used to doing something for so long. You have to
yeah,
really kind of
okay, yeah.
redesign that process of thinking about things.
You're
Yeah.
right. You're right, because last time that I worked with an external Java team, they thought that the only way to work was with Spring. So, okay, we have exactly the same problem.
Hmm.
Okay. The problem in the front end at the end is that you don't have any kind of material to actually study because there is no literature about that.
Yeah, which goes back
So
to
you
resources.
need,
Yeah.
yeah, you need a double jump. So you need
Right.
to read the books, understand what they were trying to say in the Java world, and then you need to apply that to your world. So I think the answering your question is double jump the problem.
Yeah. And I think part of it goes back to the topic of functionality that we were talking about a little bit earlier with a lot of the logic, basically, a lot of times is in the back end and not necessarily in the front end. But now that things are changing and shifting a bit, you do have to also think about that and shift your mindset, I think, when it comes to that as well.
Yeah, exactly. For example, in front end today, when you're talking about UX, you usually use the optimistic UI. Okay, so
Hmm.
you don't click and then wait for the server. You just click and you say, okay, everything is all right. Let me handle that.
Yeah,
And you just work on the worst case scenario.
exactly.
But if you do that, the front end should be able to do almost the same operations as the backend because they need to simulate what is going to happen.
Yeah.
So if you are, for example, you are working with the classical order and order row aggregate,
Hmm.
okay, you need to do something very similar on the front end because when you manipulate an order, you need to
Hmm.
see the different what you did in the same time that you're clicking,
Yeah.
and not
Not to
just
wait
when
until
they
you get the
not to
response.
wait and exactly
Exactly.
not to wait.
So you want it to be eventually consistent, but you're not keeping your user wait on you. And that's why a lot of
exactly.
things are happening asynchronously. Yeah.
And they need to happen sometimes also similar
Right.
in a similar way. So the complexity of the code is not so different sometimes.
Yeah. That makes sense. Now, shifting a little bit into a bit more detail, if you would. So we are talking about domain-driven design, which we have to focus on the domain and the question at hand with the business side a lot of times. Let's talk a little bit about CQRS and what does that mean for front-end application? Because you and I have had conversations about using Axon or various other things. So what does it mean for the front-end applications to use CQRS? Do they need to? Is it necessary?
I will not say that it is necessary,
Okay.
but I think that
It always depends,
CQRS,
right?
yeah, of course, it's always the answer for every question in software
Exactly. It
development,
depends.
I think. But okay, let's concentrate for a moment on CQRS. So just on the separation between the read model and write model. It actually made a lot of sense for the front end. Because the purpose of the front end is to display data
Right.
and to get data from the users. Okay, so you always have a different mental model for front end and for printing data that if you want is reading data. So
Right.
what you in the backend you call a read model, if you want in the front end you can call a render model because you can show the same data set in different ways.
Right.
And you have the write model. The write model are just the JSONs that you need to send to the server.
Correct.
Um, I try to do that sometimes when you need a very, very complicated transformation in order to have performances. So
Mhm.
what I do is that I receive data from the server. So I receive the JSONs. I can't have two different databases, okay? Because if the backend is not in CQRS itself, so
Right.
I think if you have a backend that is just a simple CRUD, okay, simple.
Mhm.
But so what I do is that I take the JSONs and then I prepare all the mapping beforehand in the
Right.
background with web workers or something like that. So the user don't have to wait. So when you, for example, change the visualization, I don't know, like a calendar, okay, from a week to a grid to some other stuff, they are already prepared from the users.
Mhm.
The result is different, but the idea it's very similar to the CQRS pattern.
Yeah.
Then we have the other part, event sourcing. Okay, event sourcing it's a very helpful. Okay, I will not talk about event sourcing because I don't want that people think that it's actually the same. Let's talk about event-driven architectures. It's more correct.
Gotcha.
Okay. And I think that event-driven architecture are useful in two main scenarios. And the first one is when you need to keep a lot of data synchronized between devices or tabs, for example, in a front-end application. Okay,
Yeah.
so chats or messages system and so on. When you have a lot of things that, I don't know, Sara is writing, you want to print that like in Slack.
Right.
Probably you need a socket that is working between your clients.
Sure.
And the best way to do that is with events. With a simple event, it is person wrote something,
Right.
and in the payload you have Sara. Okay, this is
Mm-hmm.
one of the scenarios, and the other one is when you have micro frontends, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you have micro frontends, you can use some API. I think that one API is called broadcast channel. That is an event tunnel in the browser
Okay.
uh, that you can use to communicate between different iframes, different web component, or different tabs between the same browser.
Gotcha.
So there is this is something that not a lot of front-end developer knows, but there is an event tunnel in every browser that you can use for fun and profit. as we would say.
Yeah, this is good. This is great to know. Now I'm going to go play around with it. Um, you did mention something that I wanted to ask you about. So you were talking about if the front end application is using CQRS and the backend is not. Um, is it necessary for both to sort of be in sync in that sense, or does it not matter if the front end is? Because we know that the front end doesn't always have to be CQRS for the back end to be. Is this kind of vice versa, or do you prefer the back end to also
It
be?
could be.
Yeah.
It could be because, for example, um, for a lot of reasons, you may have, for example, a very, very old application, okay, with
Hmm.
an old UI, and then you
Right.
can create a new UI with the same database. In that case, for example, you may have a very different data visualization from the same data set, but you don't need to also change the data set to do that.
Right.
Or at least you don't have to do it immediately. You can do it
Gotcha.
in two separate times, separate works. So I
Makes
think that
sense.
are related because you can have a very, very simple backend and a very complex front end,
Mhm.
or vice versa.
Vice versa.
Uh,
Yeah.
uh,
So they don't have to be the same at all times. Can, but don't have to
exactly.
be. Cool.
Or
Yeah. Go
I
ahead.
can make another example.
Sure.
You may also have two different front-end application that for different kind of users.
Right.
Back office and, for example, end user,
Right.
they can share the same backend application sometimes.
Yeah. Makes sense.
So
Yeah.
one is CQRS, the other one is not.
Right. Makes sense. Yeah, that's great. Now, can you talk about some scenarios where you think that we did talk a little bit about some examples for the front end with CQRS and event-driven architecture. Um, any other benefits that you can think of, or we can kind of make the cases for front end developers as, hey, let's go learn more about DDD or CQRS because it's useful. So can we talk a little bit more about examples or
Okay.
cases that you've come
I
across?
Yeah, I can give you two different set of example.
Perfect.
The first one is about plain DDD. Okay, so plain domain objects without frameworks. And this is extremely useful when you work with legacy applications.
Right.
Because in a lot of cases, I've been called as a consultant to say, okay, I have this very, very old application. Okay, a little context. In a front-end application, very old, it's 5 to 8 years.
Okay.
Okay, so we have a different lifespan of a backend. But I have a very old framework that I can't work with anymore because I don't find people that want to work with whatever reason. So
Right.
I want to shift to a new framework.
Hmm.
What I do in these cases is to, okay, let's start extract everything that we can away from the original framework.
Right.
And then when you have your domain, you have your repositories, services, you have all the kind of stuff that it's as much as possible unrelated from the original framework, we can decide to add another framework for rendering, for example, because the most challenging part for a front-end application is rendering. It's where you usually need to use a framework because it's hard to create a performant rendering engine. But
Right.
all the other stuff, it's actually doable. I will not say easy, but it's doable.
Sure. Right.
Uh, Event sourcing. Event sourcing, it could be interesting when you have an event sourcing backend, also to use some event architecture on the front end because you
Hmm.
can do optimistic UI based
Right.
on events.
Hmm.
So, as an example, I send an event to a server, but in the same time, I send the exactly same event via a socket to all the client connected.
Hmm.
And this is interesting because I can send the event, I can wait for another event of confirmation that the backend is okay. But in the meantime, every client connected to the socket can just update their UI.
Right.
with the same a chat system, for example. I can send a
Right.
message. I send the message through the socket to the client, and then I wait for a confirmation from the server when it will
Whenever
arrive. I
it
don't
comes.
need
Yeah.
to, yeah, whenever it comes.
Yeah.
And if you have event sourcing or Axon on the backend,
Hmm.
using it also with a socket and the front end, it could lead to a very elegant approach.
Got it. Right. It would be a smooth operation, which is just always
Yeah,
nice.
yeah, exactly,
Exactly.
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 Because you can use the same mindset for the backend to front end communication, but also to client communication or tabs to tabs communication, something like that.
Makes sense. Now, when do you recommend the front end applications to use DDD, CQRS event sourcing? I know that a lot of times in our trainings, we talk about sort of taking the monolithic approach at the very beginning when you design your systems, but make sure that you're designing them with the clear API designs and putting some thought into that, because in the future, if you want to modularize it, then it's easily, well, not necessarily easily, but it's doable. And then you can go into microservices if you decide to in the future. But at the very beginning, if you, let's say, if you don't need to use CQRS, for instance, or if you don't need to use this sort of distributed systems, don't approach it right away. Is this the same case for the front end? Do you recommend that folks don't necessarily jump right into DDD, CQRS, event-driven architecture if they don't need to?
Absolutely, because for a front end, a modern front end application, so something
Mhm.
that I'm starting writing in 2022,
Yeah.
um, it's quite easily to split stuff later because we have in the front end we have tree shaking is called. Okay, so I have my index.js,
Yeah.
and this index.js create a tree of dependencies. I can create a part of the tree that is asynchronous. So, for example, this is done for performances reason, not for code quality reason, like for example on the backend.
Right.
But the result is very similar if you split your code with a DDD in mind. When
Gotcha.
I start navigating a part of the application, I will download it and the user will start working on it. But in order to do that, your code should be splitted in a cool way,
Right.
not necessarily by bounded context. But the point is that the reason that because you are splitting it, because if you are splitting it for maintainability, probably you should use a DDD approach, but you can also start very simple and splitting by navigation. So for
Hmm.
example, if you start, you need to log in, you just have the login application. This is just a part of your code.
Right. Right.
Then you have the list, you have advanced settings, everything is separated.
Yeah.
And this is the simple part. It's actually how most frameworks work out of the box.
Right.
You can also do think different. So you can just working with bounded context, and then you can have a micro front end architecture when in
Hmm.
the same page you have different pieces that are communicating through events.
Yeah. Makes sense. That's really interesting to find out more about, and I would love to um, learn a little bit about what we discussed today, more from your writings as well. So I'll be sure to add the links for the listeners to check out your books and other content that you'd like to share. On a separate topic, you are doing a meetup with a couple of my colleagues here in a few months, right? Um, can
Yeah,
we talk a little bit about that? What are you guys going to talk about, and where is it going to be? And can people access it remotely as well, or is it only in person?
it will be hybrid, so it will be in Italy, here in Treviso, near Venice. It will be
Right.
in September,
Great.
and it will be about exactly this topic: how to
Perfect.
create a, a front-end application with DDD.
Nice.
And I think I need to work on it, but I think that is, like I said before, a shift from a simple application made with the framework's way,
Mhm.
and I can just start to removing pieces from the framework and add it to a complex domain with objects and repositories, services, and so on.
Yeah.
And as a bonus track, I will probably then add also an event sourcing layer
Mhm.
to communicate between client and server. This will probably be the topic, and it should be hybrid, so we can
Nice.
actually see that also online.
Awesome. Really exciting things happening for you and for us as well, and together collaborating, which is
Yeah,
great.
exactly.
So fantastic. Really looking forward to see what in the future will bring, and we'll talk about as we go on and sort of explore these various topics. But I wanted to thank you so much, Francesco, for being here today and spending some time and talking about some things that I somewhat knew about, but not exactly. So thank you for, yeah, making me aware of them and making me excited to learn more about it. So appreciate your time.
No, thanks to you. It's been a pleasure to talk about this stuff because I think it's something that people need to explore more. So it's been an honor, and I'm really proud to talk about this stuff with you.
Thank you. Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. Thank you. And I'm so happy we finally made it work. I know we've been talking about it for over a year, and I'm so
Yeah,
excited
yeah,
to.
yeah.
Yeah,
This is
life had a couple of little
exactly.
hiccups for us here and there, but I'm glad we finally got together and talked about this really interesting topic. Thanks again, and I'm sure we'll chat again soon. Have a good
Yeah,
one.
thank you.
Bye. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Francesco. Please join me next time as I discover other interesting topics with wonderful guests. Until then, have a great time and happy coding!